He thought he knew the shape of his life. The routine had comforted him for years. A steady job at the logistics firm, a blue sedan that smelled like coffee and old leather, Saturday football games with his sons, and slow Sunday mornings when the house softened into sunlight. He was 39 when the world cracked along a line that had always been there, but he never saw. Michael Reed loved like most decent men. Love. Quietly, with the small sacrifice of time that builds trust. He loved Sarah with the kind of patient faith that takes decades to earn. He built a home, signed the mortgage, learned to fold the laundry the way she liked, and learned the names of her father's old war buddies. When their children were born, he stopped sleeping through storms. A tiny foot at the edge of the bed could wake him from a deep dream. People in town described him as steady, a safe word for a man who preferred to fix things rather than tell stories about them. He didn't drink much, kept his temper, paid his taxes. He made mistakes. Who doesn't? But nobody would have thought he'd be the one who wakes up one night to find the house turned into another life. It started as a notification on his phone. An odd timestamp, a name he didn't recognize, a line of words that didn't belong in the metaphor they had named marriage. He paused, told himself it must be a mistake, an old thread resurfacing. He scrolled, heart accelerating as the evidence assembled. Late-night locations, whispers of meetings, pictures cropped to intimate shapes. It wasn't just a message, it was a trail. He confronted Sarah the next day, not with thunder or accusation, but with the precise quiet of someone whose trust had been catalogued and found missing. Her face didn't crack into the panic he expected. Instead, she moved like an actor who had rehearsed 1,000 exits, practiced regret, a hollowed apology. She blamed loneliness. She blamed the grown-up parts of life that had been taken from her. When his voice broke, the only time she had ever seen him unravel, she pressed her thumb to the place where she knew the wound lived and called him dramatic. The next weeks were a carousel of denials in public and fragments of truth in private. Michael learned the worst kind of grammar in those days, how to conjugate disbelief into silence. He tried to speak to her parents, simple, desperate conversations about loyalty and vows, only to find that they had already chosen a script. Sarah's father folded his hands and told Michael that the marriage had changed, that maybe the stress had made her seek something alive. Sarah's mother looked at him with pity, like a verdict rumors or small fires. They spread like them too, warm, then angry, until the house of everything you know is ash. He learned the town's new vocabulary: instability, sadness, he who could not keep her. People who had once waved now averted their eyes. His children's teachers whispered at conferences about anxiety at home. The bank calls about auto payments started arriving with a new edge to the voice on the line. Reputation is a fragile currency. He was suddenly poor. At night, he pressed his forehead to the window glass and watched the streetlights make halos on the wet pavement. He replayed how it had gone wrong 12 times, where he might have been less busy, less distant, more attentive. The ache of failure was compounded by an uglier, quieter argument with himself. The indignity of being blamed for someone else's choosing. He was not the villain he had been painted to be, but portrait and painting are different things. The world recognized paintings. He did something no one expected. He stopped being impulsive. Where others might have raised their fists or called his neighbor's phone with a string of profanity, Michael began to collect. Not out of malice at first, but out of a scientist's carefulness. A man who knew evidence could create the shape of truth where emotions could only deconstruct. He saved screenshots. He archived bank statements that didn't add up. He photographed receipts. He kept every email, every itinerary, every small sign of another life that wasn't his. The time he walked away from the house. By the time he placed his wedding ring into a small wooden box and slipped it into the back of his closet, he had already decided that silence would not be his ending. He would not die in the soft place of shame. He would carve a way out that made what was wrong visible. People will tell you revenge is for the powerless, and maybe that is true. Revenge is also sometimes a last sacrament of agency. When everything else is stripped, it's the one thing left to do. Michael's version would not be elegant. It would be efficient. For weeks the town watched. Sarah moved with the cool confidence of someone whose truth had been rehearsed and sanitized. She went to the office parties. She posted photos of the children at the park, where sunlight made them halos. Her parents stood with her in photos like pillars, offering the cameras a shot of normality. That cadence, the performative domesticity, was the hardest to bear. They were presenting, to each other and to the world, a script where Michael was a relic. He watched and learned. He watched the rhythms of her life outside the house. The barista who smiled a little too long. The desk in the firm where a jacket had been left. The coffee shop table with 2 mugs, one of them with lipstick on it. He followed with the patient dedication of a man who intended to build a case. He never touched anything. He never created. He recorded and preserved what already existed. The small discoveries were knives. Yes, but they were also keys. A credit card charge at a B&B across state lines. A name, then another. He learned to map the people around Sarah. An ex-colleague with a soft laugh. A man who seemed, in the pictures, to understand something about how she looked at him. He learned to read body language in photos. Tilts of the head. Hands on small backs. The angles of a smile that was not meant for him. Then one night, a call shook him awake. Liam. The name made him sit up like someone struck. Liam was a neighbor, a friend of the kids' little league, a boy neighbor, a part of the normal life they shared. Michael found his voice again and drove over, heart pounding like a drum. Liam's voice trembled through the phone. He came by, the boy said. A man. He gave Sarah a lift. That one piece of information became the hinge. Michael called his old work buddy, Jesse, who ran security for the logistics company. Jesse had surveillance skills and a taste for systems. He didn't laugh when Michael asked for help. He knew him too well. Jesse tapped into what Michael found, watched routes on grainy camera footage, supplied timestamps and windows. They didn't hack. They watched what the world already allowed them to see. The footage wasn't cinematic. No dramatic fight scene. No cinematic truths. It was grainy. It showed a dark sedan pulling into the office parking lot, then later leaving with Sarah in the passenger seat. It showed hands on a steering wheel, silhouettes speaking in the language of a small town's private world. Michael felt rage and then a cold resignation. Rage because of the betrayal. Resignation because of the inevitable next step. Exposure would create consequences far beyond personal humiliation. He could imagine wild, messy scenarios. Public shouting, an angry scene in the middle of a market. A physical affray that would feed gossip and ruin everyone. He wanted none of that. He wanted a different kind of violence, one that didn't leave him criminalized for acting out. one that used the world's own circles to bring someone down. So he planned, in the only legal and effective way he knew, he would engineer their downfall through exposure, not only of the affair, but of the rot that connected his wife's lovers, her parents, and the small corruptions they had hidden. If they had money, he would show how they had squandered or misused it. If they claimed virtue, he would show their inconsistencies. If they had insisted on moral authority, he would show them as moral authors turned frauds. It would be surgical. It would leave a record. He would not burn a house down, but he would make sure the house could no longer stand. He began by weaving a fact web. He turned his evidence into documents that could not be dismissed. Screenshots became timelines. The credit card record became a map. Paid invoices, notarized statements, copies of emails. He printed everything and sent it to lawyers, to journalists, to any local reporter who had a reputation for telling truth when the town needed it. He hired a private investigator, not to commit crimes, but to corroborate timings and statements. The investigator's report became the backbone of his evidence. Independent confirmation that this wasn't a private quarrel, but a pattern. Michael also leveraged the legal system like a man learning to use a heavy, precise tool. He filed for emergency custody modifications, citing instability. He filed subpoenas when necessary. He was careful so that nothing he did could be called fabrication. He wanted retribution, yes, but not a smear. He wanted a bench where the truth could be read, and a sentence of social accountability would follow. The family's arrogance was their undoing. Sarah's father, a man who liked influence and borrowing favors, had a small consulting arrangement with a non-profit that handled senior housing. He had used the non-profit's funds as his personal bank for a short while, thinking no one would notice. Small withdrawals here, payments to a contractor for home improvements there. He was sloppy, the kind of sloppy that is more dangerous than evil, because it looks like normal human error until a line is drawn. Michael found ledgers, invoices, and a greedy pattern the size of a small-town rumor. He took that pattern and slipped it into the stack with the screenshots of the late-night dinners. He walked into the mayor's office with a folder and a calm face. He told no lies. He showed facts. The mayor, a man who had run for re-election on a platform of integrity, had reason to move. What followed was a sequence of small dominoes. The nonprofit did an internal audit. The contractor's records didn't match the invoices. The bank called. The papers took on a life of their own. A man who had wrapped himself in community bits. Prayer breakfasts, fundraisers, a chair on the board. Found himself being asked hard questions at a meeting with microphones. Michael watched the town gather like a weather front. He had wanted silence, but instead created a storm that would scrub clean what had been hidden. He knew, with a private satisfaction that tasted bitter and sweet, that the first blows of consequence wouldn't land on Sarah alone. Her parents would feel it too. The humiliation of being called to account, of losing positions they had assumed were untouchable. He did not celebrate privately. He lay awake and imagined the faces of his children when the dust settled. What they would see, what they would be forced to reckon with. Revenge is not a feast. It is a reckoning. And he planned to stand with the truth, no matter how painful the spectacle. He had learned that if you pull on one thread in a fabric, the whole weave will eventually come apart. He wanted the town to see it all at once, to understand how tightly the affair and the corruption were braided. To do that, he needed a stage. Stages in small-town tragedies are predictable. The church potluck, The town hall meeting, the fundraiser in a community center that always smelled of coffee and fried dough. Michael chose a payday, the annual donors' breakfast for the senior housing nonprofit, the very event that Sarah's father had co-chaired for years. People who mattered would be there, donors, neighbors, the pastor who had given speeches about moral clarity. It would be an audience that liked neat fables where good men were rewarded and bad men were shown the door. He would, in that space, rip the curtain. He prepared like a man going to war without hatred. He rehearsed nothing. He did not need to. The facts were rehearsed enough. He worked with his attorney to make sure everything would be permissible, that he would not be subject to a countersuit. He confirmed that the investigator's report was clean and admissible. He arranged for a local reporter, someone who was more truth-teller than sensationalist, to be present. Then he set a secondary plan in motion, one that made the fall physically visible. He had not plotted violence, he had plotted consequence. The kinds of consequences that leave a person socially and financially vulnerable. He set up a disclosure cascade that would push the nonprofit auditors to announce an internal review that morning. When they did, their statement would be publicly read at the breakfast. It would be a small paragraph in the program, but its reverberations would be felt across the room. He also gave the reporter a folder. Inside, printed screenshots, transaction ledgers, the investigator's summary, and a clear timeline connecting the affair to the financial misdeeds. The reporter read, and then placed the folder where the pastor could notice it. The pastor, a good man who had never expected to be at the center of a scandal, initially flipped through the pages and then looked up. The room, he said, was about to encounter an ugly truth. Michael sat in the back row, palms steady on his knees. His chest trembled, but he breathed shallow and controlled. The pastor read the statement the auditors had released. Murmurs rose like bees. The reporter then stood, asked for a moment, and summarized the contents of the file for the assembled donors. He did not embellish. He simply read. Sarah's father had been implicated in questionable use of funds. The investigation indicated discrepancies. The documents also showed that Sarah had been in a relationship with a man whose business ties intersected with the non-profit. A hush fell. Conversation stopped mid-course. Forks were lifted like tiny flags. But Michael had an encore. He had prepared a physical reveal that did not require guns or force, only preparation and a humiliating clarity. He had arranged for a billboard-sized poster, ordered the night before under the guise of a lost pet sign, printed with a collage. On it were close-cropped photos, credit card receipts next to a photo of Sarah and the man exiting a motel in a neighboring town, a scanned copy of an invoice with Sarah's father's signature, and, most damning, an image of a check made out to a contractor that wound up in a shell company. Someone opened the doors, and there it was. A sudden, sharp visual that made people turn. The image had the comprehensive cruelty of a courtroom blow. Proof. Laid out like a hand on a chest. You could see the color drain from faces. Sarah's mother went pale. Sarah's father looked like a character from a failing play, trying to remember his lines and finding nothing but air. In the middle of that embarrassed silence, the reporter asked a question. Mr. Reed, do you have anything to add? It was a scene that seemed designed for melodrama. Michael stood. He felt his legs like posts. He did not shout, did not accuse. He let a piece of the investigator's report fall from his hands into the light. He let the room read for itself. There were no screams. There was no punch. There was a single audible intake, like the room inhaled at once. The board chairman excused himself. Phones were already buzzing. Someone called the police to report the auditor's findings. People gathered in tight little groups and spoke in small, urgent tones. The humiliation that followed was not the moral theatrics Michael had once feared. It was the real-world consequence of actions that had been packaged and labeled. Boards were questioned that week. Sarah's father had to step down temporarily. The nonprofit issued a public apology for procedural errors. The contractor was audited. Sponsors pulled their names. Sarah retreated from the breakfast like someone trying to melt through a wall. She stumbled past Michael in the parking lot, eyes wide and wild like a deer who suddenly sees the lights. For a moment she looked at him, as if a child had discovered an adult standing without their costume. She tried to explain, to cry, to make him believe the version of the story that had sustained them. He heard nothing. He had not come for an apology. What Michael had engineered was not simply the exposure of an affair. It was a collapse of the scaffolding that made their life appear respectable. The buffet table emptied. An SUV left with its lights on as if the driver could not stay. People who had smiled at Sarah at the school events were now avoiding her glances. He watched as her father walked to his car, head bent, and she followed, small and fragile beside him. He did not feel triumph. Not like the movies. He felt an odd clarity, a hollow room inside that was oddly peaceful. The physical world had shifted, positions lost, reputations questioned, board seats suddenly empty. That was the kind of physical justice he had wanted, making the visible world reflect the truth. The fallout did what evidence does in a small town. It rewired alliances. People who had once formed a cord of support around Sarah and her family began to fray. The pastor who loved moral simplicity now had to wrestle with ambiguity. A donor who had placed his name on the nonprofit's list soon asked that it be removed. A contractor who had benefited from favorable invoices found himself under criminal inquiry. Michael's life did not become a romance of victory overnight. There were still rough nights. The kind that make a man wonder if he has become what he despised. People still whispered. His children asked questions he had to answer without making them into weapons. But something fundamental altered. Truth is its own kind of light, and once turned on, it shows where the dirt has remained. Legal actions took their time. Sarah's father contested the auditor's findings. Sarah issued a statement that read like a script, contrition paired with minimization. The courts, slow as they are, began to thread the evidence into forms that had consequences. The non-profit demanded reimbursement. The contractor's license was reviewed. The mayor's office called a press conference that filled the local news channels. The biggest physical blow, however, came in the way the town's social fabric folded. Board invitations stopped arriving. Invitations to charity galas disappeared. The social currency Sarah's family had traded in vanished. People who once greeted them with coffee now gave them the distance of caution. Michael watched as their house, once a symbol of security and influence, began to look like an island. Their mailbox, which had always been thick with catalogs, thinned. The children's friend invitation slowed. Their son's Little League coach, a man who had once batted for Sarah's father at the company picnic, avoided eye contact. In small ways, the physical world rearranged itself around the exposure. Self-preservation has a physical choreography. When a person's name becomes questionable, their phone rings less. The grocery clerk who used to smile now looks at the register and hurries to the next customer. These are not dramatic scenes as the movies show, but they are crushing in their cumulative effect. Michael's revenge had been ductile, shaped by law and truth, not brutality. Yet he felt the old temptation to turn from the evidence to physical retribution. He stifled it. He had never wanted to be the man who broke something or someone in a way that could be framed as murder of character alone. He wanted consequence, yes, but proportional. One night, months after the breakfast, a final chapter unfolded. Sarah's father, now estranged from the nonprofit's board, and with a pending inquiry at the contractor's office, fell ill. He had always been robust, a man who smoked in the doorway and told long stories. The illness was abrupt and terrible, a stroke that left him unable to string sentences together. The physical toll was undeniable. His body, which had leaned so heavily on prestige, suddenly did not answer. Michael visited once at the hospital because something nearly viscous in him still held some tenderness. The man looked at Michael with a bewildered softness. He could no longer claim the armor of authority. There were no speeches now, only the quiet of beeping machines, and a family that must now reconcile its actions in the small grid of the ICU. Michael did not gloat. Standing at that bedside, he felt an unexpected wash of pity and a dizzying exhaustion. The revenge he had sought had not been an appetite for blood, but a demanding of truth. Now the physical world offered him a consequence he had not wished for. Human frailty in the face of exposure. Where he had wanted justice, the universe had given something more complicated, punishment and victory braided with sorrow. He sat with his children that night and told them a version of truth that did not tear the world apart. He explained, not in legalese, but in the language of what matters, that the world sometimes gives hard lessons, that people make choices, that choices have results, and that it is okay to seek accountability without becoming the kind of person who revels in suffering. The days following were not easy. There were tender apologies from neighbors who had been blinded by performance, who had cheered at gallery events and never glimpsed the ledger lines behind the generosity. Some apologized, many did not. Michael accepted apologies when they were sincere, and moved on when they were not. The town continued to turn. The nonprofit hired a temporary director who promised transparency. Sponsors who had once fled approached again cautiously, but the stain of scandal lingers in ways that alter futures. Sarah and her mother moved into a smaller house on the other side of town. They were not banished, but their social currency had collapsed into a certain privacy that felt like exile. For Michael, the physical remnants of what he had engineered remained. The nonprofit's public ledger showed corrected entries. The contractor paid fines. The little civic awards that once gleamed on a mantle diminished. These were not trophies. They were evidence of a consequence that had been distributed through the mechanisms of the town itself. There are endings that come in fanfares, and endings that arrive like the quiet closing of a book. Michael's ending was of the latter kind. He did not walk away with a smile of righteous triumph. He walked away with a pocket of quiet that had taken months to assemble. His children slept better. In school, their friendships stitched back together like a patchwork mended. He found work that kept him busy and honest. Sometimes he drove to the water tower in the evening and watched the town light itself like a constellation. Every home, a small solar system of secrets and bright edges. People sometimes asked if he regretted what he did. The question is always simpler from the outside because it compresses all the moral physics of pain into one corner. Regret or no regret. He thought of the nights when his daughter had cried alone because she had been shamed by words that could have been prevented. He thought of the difference between protecting children and protecting pride. He thought of the quiet moment when his son hugged him and said, "Thanks, Dad," after a friend at school said something kind. There was a weight that never left him, knowing his actions had contributed to someone's suffering. But he had never been sure that the alternative, keeping quiet and allowing the false story to calcify, would have been better. Silence has its own violence. He had chosen the lesser brutality of truth. Months after the scandal, at a cafe where he liked to sit and read the morning paper, a woman approached him. She had been at the donor's breakfast, a sponsor who had watched the fall of a family with a human face. She put down a cup and, with no pretense, said, "You did the right thing." It was not jubilation she offered, but recognition. Michael nodded because sometimes you can only accept what is given. The town inevitably healed in its own uneven way. People forgave without forgetting. They moved forward, reshaping the map of trust. Sarah remained a figure in their story. Some called her a cautionary tale. Others whispered about the complexities of marriage. The father never returned fully to public life. There were no fireworks. There was only the slow return of ordinary things: soccer practices, school plays, the post office with its line of people who do not know your story. On a quiet autumn evening, Michael took a walk and stopped at the place where his life and his revenge had intersected most brutally. The little park bench where he had sat after the initial discovery, watching leaves fall as if the world could not be altered by human hand. He sat down, looked at the sky, and opened his phone. He recorded something for himself. A private confession. The kind of thing you do not post to the world, but keep so the memory of what you did doesn't become a stranger. He spoke slowly, naming no names. He said, "I did what I had to do. I wanted my family safe. Some people will call it revenge. I call it justice." He breathed. Let the air expand. But I know now that truth is a terrible and beautiful thing. It can clear and it can wound. It is not a clean power. It leaves scars. I hope those scars mean something, so that someone else doesn't have to learn this the hard way. Then he turned the recorder off and walked home. When you tell a community a truth loud enough, it becomes a story everyone knows. Stories like this one find audiences in late-night comments, in quiet lunches, in whispered conversations across church pews. That is why he told the story, quietly, in a voice that was not about beating a chest, but about leaving a record. He wanted those he loved to know he had acted, meticulously and within the law, to ensure their safety and dignity. If you like this story, if this tale of betrayal and quiet retribution gripped you, please do one small thing: like the video, subscribe for more cinematic true-feel stories, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Michael? Would you have taken the same path or walked a different road? Your thoughts help shape the conversation and keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening. Stay careful with the truths you trust, and kinder with the judgments you make.